There are certain times of the year where the fish just go deep, and as much as we want to pound the bank and fish shallow, the fish just aren't there. Now, just because they go deep doesn't mean we have to go finesse, doesn't mean we have to go soft plastic or a jig. The power fisherman in me still wants to figure out how to power fish those fish. So today we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics for this time of the year, and that's deep water power fishing. So if you're ready to have some fun in the deeper water, let's do it. Welcome to the Hookup Tackle. The Hookup Tackle is the world's largest showcase of Megabass products, featuring baits and colors not found at any other dealer. The Hookup also offers a wide display of OSP, Evergreen, Depths, Lucky Craft, Jackal, and many more. The Hookup Tackle is owned and operated by family, is staffed by guides and verified tackle nerds who love helping anglers elevate their craft. If you're in the Phoenix area, we'd love to have you stop by our showroom and check out the wonderful world of Megabass and the Hookup for yourself. If you shop online, there are almost 10,000 SKUs of Megabass products alone, with hundreds of other companies and new products being added daily. So next time you're looking for that hard to find bait, that color your fish have never seen before, or maybe you just want to elevate your game, look at thehookuptackle.com. All right, welcome back, my friends. I am Ben with the Hookup Tackle, aka the Tackle Otaku on Instagram. Of course, being joined by my buddy Jeffrey the King. What's up, Jeffrey the King?
What's up? This is going to be a good video.
All right, I'm
excited.
excited. So, you know, we love fishing shallow water, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything more fun than power fishing shallow water, right? Spinnerbaits, crankbaits, swim baits, right? It's like almost being in a boxing ring with them, right? It's action-packed, right? But there are times of the year where those fish just aren't there. As much as we want them to be there, they're not. And there are times of the year where there may be some fish shallow, but there's still some really key spots deep that if we can figure out how to access those deeper fish, we could absolutely pummel them. Mm-hmm. Right? And when I think back to most days where, you know, those glory days of catching 30, 40, 50 pounds for 5, right? Almost never is it shallow. It's almost always on some piece of structure, right? So, you know, over the next few months, I would say this is probably the best time for deep water power fishing because you have multiple things happening, right? Depending on where in the country you are. You have fish that are moving from their winter haunts, wanting to go shallow to spawn. So they are going to stage and get into an area where they're almost ready to go, right? So maybe the last break, the last bend, the last rock pile, a reef, somewhere that's kind of a transition area from deep water to shallow water. And then you also have fish that will finish spawning that will then come back to those areas and kind of rest up before they then go into summer mode, right? So if we can find some of these key spots, we can hit them coming and going. And they can be great spots for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks at a time. We can spend some time looking for these key little transition areas and utilize them to get fish going in and pre-spawn and utilize them to get fish coming out in post-spawn, and we can just have a really good time doing it. Now, traditionally, you know, when we talk about deeper water, you know, like Griff's favorite way of fishing, right? Like 50, 60 feet with a drop shot and that kind of stuff, right? So, you know, traditionally it's soft plastic, it's a jig, it's dragging something around really slow. But that's not always the best way to go. And so today we're going to talk about a much funner way of approaching deep water fishing, and that's deep water power fishing. Now, before we get started, I'm going to talk about kind of my 1, 2, 3 prong approach to doing it. This is kind of like my 3 best ways, right? There are a million different ways we can do this. We could have incorporated a lot of different baits. In fact, we were talking and kind of strategizing to make sure we gave the best information on this. And we'll do this video again when it's more timely, maybe in the summertime, right? Or post-spawn, because maybe then some of these baits shift a little bit. But for right now, especially in pre-spawn, you know, late winter, early spring, you can't really go wrong with any of these options. So let's dive in and start dissecting it, Jeff. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
All right. So for me, the first place I start is I start with a deep spinnerbait. Now, we're basically going to talk about 3 different techniques today. These are my 3 techniques. So let me just talk about all 3 of them really quick. A deep spinnerbait, a lipless, and an A rig. Okay, this is kind of my 1, 2, 3 approach, and we're going to break each one down. I'm going to show you and talk to you how exactly I'm doing it. The rods, the reels, the line, exactly which baits we're using, and I'll talk through why this is my approach. Okay, so these are the 3 things that I use to really tackle deep water fishing. Now again, we could have implemented a deep diving crankbait. We could have put like a heavy swim jig. There's a lot of things we could have put in here. But day in and day out, I find that this kind of 1, 2, 3 approach works from, you know, anywhere from a deep, clear water lake where it's maybe more rocky to, you know, a shallower, grassier, maybe river type area. Deep water is going to be, you know, different based on where everybody's fishing, right? So deep water Lake Pleasant might be, you know, 30, 40 feet down to 60, 70 feet sometimes. Deep water on the Colorado River might be like 7 feet or 10 feet, right? So we can adjust these baits accordingly with weight based on what we're facing. So what I'm thinking in my head is if those fish were super juiced and super jacked, they'd be up shallow, right? They'd either be up shallow spawning, they'd be up shallow chasing bait or crushing things, right? If they're chilling in that deep water, they're not super jacked. So that's more of like a chill zone for them is what's going through my mind. Now, there could be bait down there, and they could be crushing bait. There could be crawdads. They could be eating well, right? But they're definitely not in what I would consider to be a jacked mode. So I'm approaching it in a way to where I want to be the most finessey in the beginning and work my way up to the least finessey, if that makes sense. Because you and me have seen this time and time again. As much as I want to just go and catch them on an A rig, there are so many times where it's too much for them. Right? Sure. And you throw it and like, oh, I'm going to jack them on the A rig, and you literally just scare them. Right? So I don't want to scare them. I want to be able to pick things apart, dissect areas, and get the bites. Right? So this is where I start. I start with a deep spinnerbait and what we would call slow rolling a spinnerbait. So what this allows me to do is it basically allows me to fish a jig in a way where I can basically just continuously swim it and move it. And instead of just kind of dragging and fishing it really slow, I can keep a steady pace going and kind of work this thing up and over and along the bottom contours to really pick it apart. A spinnerbait is a great option to start with because it's relatively snagless. Now, you'll snag, right? Especially if there's different bottom contours and you're working it uphill. There's different ways that it can get snagged or wedged into rocks. But for the most part, out of these techniques, this is the least likely to snag. And that's important because I don't want to get a bait down there and just disrupt the whole world, right? Because once you kind of start yanking and pulling and snapping things off, it changes the fish. They shift and they adjust, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. I don't know what that's going to do yet, so I don't want to get there yet with them, right? So I want to still be as natural as I can, but still fish fast. So what I'm looking for with a spinnerbait to slow roll is I'm looking for generally a couple things. The first thing that I'm going to look for is a heavier size. So typically if I'm running and gunning in shallow water, I'm throwing like a 3/8 or a 1/2 ounce, right? Pretty standard sizes. In the deep water for the slower roll, I'm usually going 5/8, 3/4, or even 1 ounce, okay? So what that's gonna do is that heavier weight obviously is gonna help sink the bait down there quicker, right? So that's a big plus. But it's also gonna help kind of keel the bait down on the bottom and prevent it from lifting up too fast. Now, different spinnerbaits will have different types of keeling. Some are built for being on the bottom, some are built to kind of lift. So this is where I kind of utilize a couple different baits to help me pick things apart. And these are the baits that are almost always in my arsenal. So the first one here, I just happened to grab this out, was the OSP High Pitcher Max. Okay, now this is the one that I go to if the water is crystal clear and I want max vibration. So if there's not a lot of heavy cover, right, and I want the spinnerbait to really vibrate hard, the OSP High Pitcher Max is amazing for that. It's a very light wire spinnerbait. You can see how easy it flexes, right? So it's gonna vibrate and thump really hard. The downside to that is if you're fishing too heavy of gear or too heavy of cover and you really gotta haul them out, because this flexes so easily, you'll find yourself that you don't quite get the power that a lot of times you want. But if you're fishing more open water, so say it's just a ledge break, it's a sand break, it's something where you're not gonna have to hit them and then really just crank on them hard to pull them out, the High Pitcher Max is amazing. It's usually my starting point for out here, unless there's some super heavy cover involved or unless the water is really, really deep that I need it to stay down. But for something in like that 20, 25 foot zone, this one is perfect. Now, let's say, you know, deep water is like 30 or 40 feet or maybe even 50 feet, right? So that's when I will switch over to this guy. This is the Megabass SV3 spinnerbait. So in the 3/4 ounce, you could do a double willow, or they even have one that's called slow roll. It's basically just a Colorado willow version of this. But what makes the SV3 so good in really deep water is the bait was designed to stay down on the bottom. So first thing you'll notice, it's a little more compact, but it's got a much deeper head to it. You see how far that kind of lead on that head drops? What that's going to do is that's going to keel the bait down and force it to kind of maintain its depth. And you can utilize this bait in all the sizes and just adjust the size accordingly based on the depth that you're going down. But for that deeper water, I can throw this 3/4 and it will stay down there almost the entire time. I don't have to worry about, you know, engaging my drag and letting it sink back down and get back to the bottom. I can throw it out, let it sink all the way down, and just slowly move it, and this thing is going to maintain its depth. It also has smaller blades, right, which will help prevent lift. The bigger the blade, generally the higher it's going to lift that spinnerbait up. Smaller the blade, typically the more it's going to stay down on the bottom, and this can be a really good one. Now, if it's extreme conditions, right, and we've seen it, Jeff, I mean, there's times when they're down there in 50, 60, 70, 80 feet. I mean, just crazy depths, right? Northern California, a lot of guys fish for spots. Spots are notorious for being in really crazy depths, right? Then I will switch over to a 1 ounce spinnerbait. And there are a lot of great options. OSP makes a great 1 ouncer in the High Pitch Max. But this OSP, this is the High Pitcher, just straight High Pitcher. This is a great one. It comes in a dual Colorado. It also comes in a tandem willow. This is a great one because of its size. You can see how compact it is. Nice and small, small little Colorado blades. This will maintain the depth even more. It gets down there lightning fast, and it really maintains that depth down there. Now, the other one that I'll incorporate as needed if I'm fishing super heavy cover is I'll move over to the Gancraft. So in the Killer's Bait Over, they make a 3/4 ounce version as well. This is going to be the heaviest gauge wire of everything that we've spoken about. So let's say it's deep water and it's just full of trees and roots and, you know, heavy shit, right? And we need to hit them and really haul them out. This is designed for that. It's designed for that durability. And it's a great spinnerbait. Gancraft makes a great spinnerbait. It's got a different thump, a different vibration, so this one can be good as well. Now, the key to all of this is you have to make sure that your rod, your line, everything is prepared for this. Because you're using this much more like a jig than you are, say, just kind of running, you know, shallow and burning it really fast. It's more important that you go to more of a jig type rod. And there's a bunch of rods that can be great for that. The rod of choice for me over the last year has turned into this guy. This is the new Steez AGS. This is the 7.9 heavy. I love this rod for deeper water. It is really designed as more of a jig slash maybe small, lighter swim bait rod. It's faster than a rod maybe that I would normally choose for shallow water, but it's got a lot of length. So if I'm really getting a bait out a long distance, letting it sink to the bottom, and I'm really trying to control it and I get bit, I get a lot of rod sweep with this thing for solid hook sets. Remember, the longer the rod, the more line pickup you're gonna get on the sweep. It's gonna dampen a little bit of the sensitivity. The shorter the rod, the more sensitive and the faster things happen. But the longer the rod, the more reach and the more sweep. And in this case, since we're fishing deep water, longer rods become important. So normally I'm throwing this on 20 pound. I like 20 pound. I just like the way it handles, especially if I'm dragging the bottom. But again, the heavier the line, the harder it's going to be to keep it down. The lighter the line, the more it's going to stay down, but then the less strength you're going to have. So you're going to have to find that balance based on where you guys are. But generally speaking, 16, 18, 20, 22, something in there, you're going to want it to be relatively heavy to make sure it can absorb everything. As far as the retrieve, this is something that really is, for me, is simple, and you guys can play, you can vary. I don't add trailers very often. I don't add trailer hooks. I don't want this thing to snag, right? This is just kind of my probing bait. The blades will do the work for me. So it's literally cast out, let it sink to the bottom, and it's just kind of engage the reel, and nice and slow. I just want to feel those blades moving down there. If I feel that it's coming up to something, I might just kind of lift it up and over the tree, and if I get it over the tree, I'm just going to let it kind of fall down and kind of keep the blades going, and then I'm back to a slow moving. I just want this spinnerbait on the bottom, just kind of moving up and over, just like a bait fish would be moving around the bottom. All right, next for me, if they're not eating the spinnerbait, right, the next place I go to is usually a lipless. Now, there are 9 million lipless. We talk about a couple here on a regular basis, one of them being the LV500. This is definitely LV500 season as far as I'm concerned. This is where this bait really shines. Definitely probably the staple in the lipless world that everybody kind of is held accountable to, right? What makes an LV500 so good for this time of the year is it is a lure that you can not just cast and wind, right? But it's a bait that you can drag and fish on the bottom like a jig. And we talk about this fairly often, but I'm gonna kind of break this down for you guys. If you want a different type of sound, a little bit different approach, Megabass makes the Vibration X Ultra. This is a great one as well. So, you know, this is just gonna give you a little bit different sound. It's gonna give you a little bit different lift than the LV500. Sometimes you will find that just a little different sound, a little different action can make a difference. But day in and day out, this guy gets the job done for me. So basically what I'm doing with an LV500 is, you know, obviously I can take this and I can throw this in the tank and wind it in, and you're gonna see this gonna have this great little tight motion. It's gonna make sound and look just like a fish swimming through the water, right? But I'm going to use this the same way that I'm throwing a jig. It's basically just a jig alternative. So you can take this bait, throw it out, I'm letting it sink all the way to the bottom, and I'm just kind of dragging it, right? I'm literally just kind of dragging it along the rocks, banging it around. Maybe every once in a while I'll just kind of give it a little hop with my rod and let it fall back down, lightly kind of stroke it off the bottom, right? I'm not looking to do too much with this thing, because if I do too much, it's got a crazy sound, right? So I'm not looking to get it down there and just like startle the shit out of them. I'm looking to get it down there and utilize the bait to just create little sounds. Right? Just little hops, little grinds, and basically it's just a little different profile. I want those hooks to kind of snag and then kind of pop off as I drag, right? It's giving me a little bit more reaction-inducing movement than, say, something like a jig or a Texas rig that's just going to naturally just climb and crawl and move through things without getting any kind of resistance. This time of the year, the LV500 can be absolutely deadly, and you guys should definitely incorporate this in if you guys live places where they eat things on the bottom, like a Texas rig, a jig, any of the things we talked about. This could get you some extra bites or some bigger class fish that maybe you're not getting now throwing the soft plastics. It's not going to replace the soft plastics, right? There's still a place for all of those things. This is just going to allow you to fish a little quicker, a little more aggressive, and it causes bites that maybe a jig or a worm wouldn't do, right? And allows you to stay in a power fishing mode, to kind of just keep moving it, keep stroking it. When this thing lays on the bottom, it looks like nothing, right? So a lot of times when you're throwing a jig or a worm, you're just letting it soak down there for 10, 15, 20 seconds at a time, and you're just moving it a little bit, and then you're just letting it lay down there. And it can become very, very cumbersome and boring, right? This is a bait that you're constantly going to keep moving. So I'm constantly kind of moving my rod, right? I want it to keep crawling, maybe just light stroking it, right? And this is an amazing bait also this time of the year, because this is a time of the year where we still get a lot of shad die off. The water temps are kind of at their coldest spot. And so that bait is starting to die, shad are starting to die. And when you see a shad die, it always kind of does this and then kind of falls down, right? Then kind of falls down. The same idea that a blade bait is effective. It's essentially just giving them a little bit different look with a little bit of sound to induce some strikes. Now, as far as rods go, same thing that we talked about with the spinnerbait. You're going to want to make sure that the rod you're throwing is sensitive and more like a jig rod and less like a crankbait rod, because we're going to be throwing this in deeper water. It's going to be sinking down deeper. Sensitivity is going to be very important. You need to know what that bait is doing. You need to feel the bite. Some of these bites will rip it out of your hands, but a lot of them will be just like a jig bite, just be a pressure bite or a boom, right? You need to be able to feel it. Because it's got treble hooks, you still want that rod to have a little bit of give to it, right? So once they're hooked, you still want to be able to absorb some shock. The two rods I use all the time, this is the Megabass Destroyer P5 Mad Bull. I love this rod. It's a little bit short, it's 7 foot, but if you guys are fishing more like river systems, shallower lakes, that kind of stuff, this one is perfect. It's ultra sensitive and it's got a lot of power to it. The other rod that I use in bigger water is, again, going back to a Steez AGS, this is the Power Pitch. So it's a 7.2 heavy, actually designed for pitching and jig type fishing, but because of it being this new AGS, it has this nice kind of softer tip to it. So it's got the power of a jig rod, but it still absorbs a lot of that shock and pressure for those treble hook baits, and it gives you the sensitivity you need with a jig rod. All right, and finally, let's jump to probably my favorite all-time technique, and that is an A rig. Okay, now an A rig is just so fun to fish. It's just a great way to show them a whole school of bait instead of one shad at a time, right? So, this time of the year when they're sitting on structure, you're still seeing bait balls, you're still seeing schools of bait, schools of shad moving through. And if you can present an A rig correctly, this can be an absolutely amazing tool for you guys down there. Now, the reason I don't start with an A rig is just like we talked about in the beginning. Sometimes it's a little much, right? So we've seen it a lot of times where if we start with an A rig and they're not ready for it, it spooks them and they're done, right? So I usually work my way to an A rig until I'm convinced that they will eat this. Once I know they'll eat it, then it's game on. Then
over.
Everything else goes away, and all of a sudden there's only one rod in my boat, and it has this thing tied onto it, okay? So let's talk about first the A rigs, the riggings. We'll cover some baits and all that, because I want to make sure you guys know exactly what to do with this, okay? So first off, with A rigs, there's two basic A rigs that I'll throw. So this is one that we have made locally here. We call it the B rig or the back rack rig, but they're all handmade. This is usually my starting point. I like this one. We had these developed for us years ago when we were going down to back rack every 3-4 weeks, because no other A rig was really standing up to the abuse we were putting on it. This is not the prettiest rig, but it's the strongest rig. So this rig will allow me to catch the most fish and not worry about arm fatigue, arm failure, anything like that. I can snag it, I can pull it, I can shake it out of stuff and not worry about an arm breaking off, right? So usually this is my go spot. I'm pretty simple when it comes to deep water A rig. I like 5 arms and I like some blades, right? You can use whatever works for you. There's 7-arm rigs, there's 9-arm rigs, there's 3-arm rigs, there's blades, no blades, whatever. I try to keep it pretty simple. For me in the deep water, it's going to be more about angle and approach and choosing the right bait, and less about how many arms are on there and is there 5 blades or 4 blades or 8 blades. I don't give a shit about that, right? So this is usually where I start. If you want an alternative bait to it, anything in the Hog Farmer line is great as well. So they make an awesome A rig. You guys are very familiar with those. So again, I just stay in the 5-arm versions of the Hog Farmer. Those tend to lend themselves best to this deeper water presentation. Now, let's talk about baits really quick, because baits can make a big difference on how this thing works. So there's 3 main baits that I utilize. Now again, there are so many paddle tail swim baits out there. I mean, every brand pretty much has a paddle tail.
I would say so.
At this point,
there's a lot.
right? There's tons. And they all have little differences with them, right? And you can absolutely go nuts on this. So experiment, play. This is part of the fun of a rig, is that it lets you play with different baits, especially if a lot of guys are throwing a rig in your area. Changing the baits can lead to some extra bites for you. So for me, I keep this relatively simple. It's a semi-science. It makes perfect sense in my head.
Okay.
Right? So it's a semi-science. So I have 3 baits. These are the 3 baits I throw on an A rig, I would say 98% of the time. Okay? Right there. Megabass Spark Shad, Keitech Fat Swing Impact, OSP Dolive Shad. Okay? So if you're going to start, these are the 3 that I would recommend paying the most attention to. And we'll talk about a couple other ones, but these are the key ones. Now here's how I figure this out. Obviously, whatever the fish are eating, that's the right answer, right? But you have to start somewhere, right? So generally speaking, the Spark Shad is going to have the slowest movement. It's going to have a very tight movement, so a little bit thicker plastic, right? So it's going to have a little tighter movement, very, very natural. I find that the Spark Shad absolutely destroys in cold water. So when it's really cold, those fish are not active. It has just a really lifelike movement that imitates fish, whether it's shad, tilapia, bluegill, imitates fish moving in cold water. The Keitech has a very wide movement to it. Okay, it's a much softer plastic, it's much thinner, so it's going to have a much bigger tail kick to it. So this one I find is best when I want to fish the rig more aggressively. Maybe I want to incorporate some twitches or some movements to it and get the thing to really kind of kick and flare and do all this stuff. Maybe I want to fish it fast and kind of burn it through. The Keitech can be a great one for that. The Dolive Shad is kind of a blend of the two. It's kind of an in-between one, right? So it gives you the tail kick. You notice it's a little thicker in the head, thinner at the tail. It gives you the tail kick, so it gives you that fast motion, but it still gives you that kind of body rock that the Spark Shad does. So for me, this is just a great starting point, because the most important thing to me is figuring out the color. Then I can start playing with the baits, right? So the downside to a Dolive Shad is they're relatively soft. Like all Dolive plastics, they are going to catch fish, but they're not incredibly durable. So if I can catch them on something like this, I'm going to go through less baits, right? So this is kind of the combination for me and how I dissect this. If it's freezing cold, I'm probably just going to start here. If it's really hot, I might start here. But if it's kind of in between, which is kind of what we get now, right? That water could be 50, it could be 60, right? It's kind of in between level. I like to start with the Dolive Shad. Now, I mentioned that the most important thing is figuring out the color. Really important that on these rigs, you can get a pack and put all the same color on them. I think you will have much more success. I'm convinced of the success rate if you turn your rig into some kind of United Nations of colors, okay? Play with colors. What I do, so out here in Arizona, we can only have 2 hooks, right? If you live in California, you can have 3 hooks. If you go down to Mexico, or a lot of you guys, there's no rules, right? 5 hooks, 7 hooks, 10 hooks, whatever, right? What I generally try to do is I try to identify the color that I think they're going to respond to the best, right? So like here's a typical Arizona rig, and again, this is the rig that we make in-house, and you'll notice that the bottom 2 wires are longer than the top 3. So a lot of rigs, when you buy 5 arms, the middle arm is the longest, right? So if you can only use 2 hooks, I like this one as well because it puts the hooks down at the bottom, and most of the time the fish are going to hit it kind of coming up to it, right? So I'll put the colors that I most believe the fish are going to eat, right? So that might be like a white or like a natural shad type color. On the top, I usually put hooks. If I have 5 hooks, let me see that one real quick. If you guys can utilize multiple hooks, On the top, I might put something different. Like the top would be a great place to put like a green pumpkin, right? Or something that might be, if you're doing a shad color on the bottom, maybe you do a bluegill color or a tilapia color on the top, right? And that way, if you get bit a couple times on that top color, then you can shift your colors around and put those colors on the bottom and then put different colors up top. Or maybe it just keys you into, dude, they're eating green pumpkin, or they're eating purple, or they're eating chartreuse, or whatever the case may be. Utilize that on your bottom ones. And then in the middle, a lot of times I'll use kind of a shock color, like a chartreuse and blue, something just to create some pop. Now, once you've got it dialed, then you can go to more of a solid tone, right? So like this one would be like, if they're just feeding on shad, I've got some 3 whites and I got a couple of like blue albinos, right? But always I like some kind of shade difference on my rig. It's the same as when you get a lure, right? If you buy a white lure, you're very rarely getting a lure that's just white bottom all the way around. It's usually white on the bottom and then it kind of fades into like a bluish or a black back or some kind of different color. It's the same here on the rig, right? You're just creating some contrast. You're creating something that's just going to trigger those fish and give them a little pop that makes them go and get it. Now, as far as technique and how we're doing this, in the deep water, I'm not as concerned with this thing kind of flaring out, shifting, you know, doing a lot of fancy stuff. Now, sometimes it makes a difference, but usually I'm fishing this the same way I'm fishing my spinnerbait, okay? I'm gonna make my cast. Try not to hook you, Jeff.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I'm making my cast out, I'm letting it sink down, okay? And then I'm basically just pointing the rod tip down. I'm kind of turning myself semi-sideways, and I'm just slowly kind of moving it, and I want to feel what's happening down there on the bottom, right? And then if I feel that it's starting to come to a snag, same thing as I do with the spinnerbait, I'm just kind of lifting that rod tip up and over, right? Kind of lifting it through, and then back down, and then continuing the retrieve, okay? Maybe every once in a while, I'll incorporate just a little reel turn just to get those baits to kind of kick and move. But really here, you're gonna get that kind of deflection movement if you hit a rock, if you hit a tree, if you get it to crawl up and over something. But really we're trying to figure out these angles. Those fish are gonna be positioned, they're gonna be ready to ambush something. Okay, so this isn't like suspended fish that you gotta really kind of trick into biting. They're down there in deeper water anyways, so we can slow roll this the same way we would slow roll a spinnerbait. Almost always it's 20-pound fluoro. Straight fluoro is my preferred. I think you get way more bites on straight fluoro than a braid. Braid creates a lot of noise in the water. So I like going just a round line. Straight fluoro is great. Typically on rod, I like the TS Destroyer Blackjack is my #1. If I'm feeling really bougie, I'll go with like an Arms or, you know, the 7.4 Valkyrie is a good one. I like using just like an HD type reel, like a Zillion HD is great. You know, something like that at Tranks 200 would be good if you're a Shimano guy. I don't feel like you need to go to a full-size 300 or 400 size swim bait reel unless you need it to fit your rod. But if you're doing a Blackjack, an Arms, a Valkyrie, you know, Bass X, if you want more of a budget-friendly one, they make a nice one. So there's a lot of options out there. The importance of kind of turning to the side on these fish is it's very important, right, as you're moving this through. If you get bit, okay, all I want you to do is just turn to the side, okay? So it should look something like this. Oh, bit, turn the side, and normally that's all you need, and they're on. And your rod's gonna load up, and then just start winding. Hold the rod still, wind, okay? None of this like wind down, this kind of stuff, right? Because remember, you've got 5 wires going different directions. So the more you pull, the more this thing is like flexing and doing strange things, right? So you want that connection to be as solid as possible. So once that fish is hooked up, up, bite, turn, right? And all you're gonna do is just wind. You're gonna try to keep this part of your body as solid as you can. So as you're winding, it's keeping the most direct contact to that fish, okay? If you can, haul them straight in, and then if you're a swimbait guy like Jeff, you're probably gonna get a net, right? But if you're a real man, then you're just gonna flip that thing in the boat, call it a day, game over, hallelujah, right? Calling you out there,
So you're
guy.
bouncing a 12-pounder.
No problem. I might have to bend over for a 12-pound.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So that's it. The importance, though, of this side turn is because you're going to miss some. So sometimes, especially if you don't have hooks on every bait, they're going to hit the top, they're going to hit the front, they're going to bump it. And if all you do is, okay, there's a fish, and you turn and you miss, right? You can keep swimming. And a lot of times they'll come back. I'd say almost every time they come back and actually eat it, right? Because you just kind of made it move away, and then boom, they get it. Whereas if you get a bite and you actually swing and it jerks that A-rig up, that's super unlifelike, so they're probably not going to eat it. But the biggest thing with an A-rig is, you're fishing it down there in structure. You want to make sure that each bait stays separated. Okay, so a lot of times if you jerk too hard, this rig will flex and the baits will wrap. And then you get this, and then there's no way anything's eating this as it's spiraling through the column, right? So while we're talking about bait wrap, let's talk really quick too about letting this thing sink and how far you want this thing to be spread out. So if you guys are new to A-rig fishing, you want to make sure that your rig is spread out far enough to where when these baits flex on the cast, they're not wrapping on each other. Okay, if you're getting rigs that are wrapped like this, then you either don't have them spread far enough, you made a poor cast, or you let it sink in properly. Okay, and we'll cover that right now. Make sure they're spread far enough away. When you cast, very important with your A-rig rod that you have some give at the top. It's got to have some bend, okay? Because the way this cast is going to go is it's going to be a lob cast, and it's going to be fluid, right? You want to come back, and you want to have a fluid stroke forward so that the rod is helping to pendulum and kind of shoot that bait out. And that rig should be casting very straight. When it lands in the water and it starts to sink, very, very important that you maintain a semi-taut line as it's sinking. Okay, so you don't want to throw it out, let it land, and just start sinking in deep water on a totally slack line, right? You want to make sure that it lands and that you're gradually giving it line. Okay, what that will do is if you just let this thing sink in the water, the weight's all over the place. It's going to do all kinds of goofiness. You're going to get your line wrapped around the rig. You're going to get hooks wrapped. If you throw it correctly and it lands and you keep the line semi-taut, then it will keep it out of the way and it will sink at a very stable, very easy pace. It won't get wrapped. All right, guys, so that is a wrap on my favorite 3 ways to, power fish deep water. Remember, a lot of people are afraid to incorporate some of these things, especially in deep water, because, none of us like to lose baits, right? The last thing I want to do is throw a $50 or $70 A-rig down on the bottom and lose it, or, a $15 Lipless, right? We don't want to lose any of these things, but if you get a little courage, right, and you lose that fear and put it down there, you will find the more you do it, the more ways you figure out how to prevent yourself from losing them. You're also going to present baits that nobody else is presenting. So while everybody is out there throwing a worm, throwing a jig, dragging around a soft plastic, you're giving the fish a totally fresh look, something that they're not seeing from anybody else. It could put the advantage in your favor. You could catch bigger fish and more fish than what you've been doing. So hopefully this was useful. If you guys have any questions, drop it down below in the comments. I will get to it. Jeff will leave links to the products. And Jeff, let's do some deeper dives maybe into the A-Rig. We can dissect this thing so much. So why don't we do a full deep dive A-Rig video too, and we'll talk about shallow, mid, deep. I know Griff likes putting blades and CJ likes putting, there's so many different things we can do to it.
Yeah.
For deep water fishing, I think the way we talked about it, that's what I would do probably 98% of the time. So hopefully this is useful. Guys, appreciate the time. Again, any questions, holler. Until next time, peace.